So thanks to everyone as you come and settle in. So welcome to our second panel of the conference. The panel is titled The Famine of 1932 to 33, as reported by diplomats and representatives of foreign governments. I'm Heather Coleman. I'm the Director of Religion and Culture at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, so I don't work in the Holodomor field, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our speakers today have to say. Our first speaker is Paolo Fonzi from the Humboldt University of Berlin. His talk is titled, A Trial of Strength Against the Restive Peasantry, What the Germans Knew About the Great Famine in the USSR and How They Perceived It.
So, thank you a lot for the invitation to this very nice conference. The first thing that I have to say is a warning. I'm severely jet lagged from my flight yesterday, so you will excuse me if I make some mistakes. So the paper that I submitted for the conference, which is the draft of an article that I'm preparing about the German perception of the 1931-33 Soviet famines, addresses two main issues. The first one is the amount and the quality of information that Germans had about the famine. In this regard, I look at the information sources of the Germans and then at what I call the politics of information about the famine that was practiced by major institutional actors in Germany between 1932 and 1933. The second topic of the paper relates rather to the content of the diplomatic dispatches and looks at the way the German diplomatic corps make sense of the famine, investigate which patterns of perception shaped their explanation of the famine. I'm going to look at these topics separately in today's presentation. After the inception of collectivization in 1929, information about what was going on in the Soviet Union reaching the outside world was dramatically reduced. Soviet authorities not only held a tight grip on information, but also limited the presence and the freedom of movement of foreigners in the country. Therefore, reliable information about Soviet affairs became an extremely scarce commodity and was strongly sought after. It is not an exaggeration to say that between 1939 and 1933, and 1933, among the great powers, Germany had access to the largest amount of information about internal Soviet affairs. The main reason for this lies in the field of international relations. Germany had been the first major power to establish intense relations with the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. With the Treaty of Rapallo of 1922, the two major outsiders of the post-Versailles international system, Germany and the Soviet Union, had sought to regain room for maneuver in the international arena. The special relation that was thus forged led to the establishment of numerous ties between the two countries. At the time of the famine, for example, Germany had 7 diplomatic missions in the Soviet Union, 3 of which were located in Ukraine. One in Odessa, one in Kharkov, and one in Kiev. Apart from the Rapallo policy, Germany had intense relations with the communities of ethnic Germans living scattered in the Soviet Union that had settled in the Russian Empire over the course of the 18th and 19th century. The ethnic Germans reported regularly to the consulate about what was going on in the countryside. Therefore, the German diplomatic corps information gathering, unlike that of other diplomats, reached outside the cities. At the peak of starvation in 1933, for example, a German consul in Kiev reported that approximately 50 German peasants visited every day the consulate to ask for assistance, and on that occasion, they provided also crucial insights into what was going on in the countryside. At the height of the famine, ethnic Germans sent also a considerable number of letters, the so-called Hungerbriefe that you can see in the picture, to Germany. A large number of them was addressed to religious institutions. In addition, ethnic Germans who emigrated to Germany upon their arrival forwarded letters received by their relatives in Ukraine to the Foreign Office. Also, many addressees who live in Germany wrote to the Foreign Office, to the Auswärtiges Amt, on behalf of their relatives, forwarding the letters they had received. In 1933, several religious, charity, and pro-ethnic Germans organizations, with a strong initiative of the Mennonite community, set up an umbrella relief committee under the name Brüder in Not, in charge of collecting funds from state agency and private donors and organizing the delivery of food packages and money transfer via the Torxin shops to the starving Germans. In order to identify the Germans in need of relief, a central card file of all hunger letters with the addresses of the sender was kept at the German Foreign Office. In 1933, a British diplomat, struck by the efficiency of the German ethnic network, wrote that, quote, the ethnic network that most functions to convey information, aid request, and aid is the German one, unquote. In addition to this, a sizable number of German citizens, Reichsdeutsche, lived in the Soviet Union. Spurred by the economic slump in Germany and by the concomitant development of the industrial sector in the USSR from 1930, many Germans, particularly skilled workers and engineers, emigrated to the Soviet Union. According to a figure of 1935, there were 6,000 to 2,500 of which were in Ukraine, the epicenter of the famine. Some of these people wrote detailed reports upon their return in Germany. Moreover, returnees from the Soviet Union were systematically interrogated by the Gestapo that excerpted their interrogations to collect testimonies about the famine. Cultural institutions played a major role in channeling information from the Soviet Union. Cultural relations with the Russian Empire had given rise in Germany to a considerable number of institutions dealing with the history of Eastern Europe. After the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles, the so-called Ostforschung, the Eastern Research, established itself in Germany as a multidisciplinary academic field with numerous journals that published regularly on current affairs in the Soviet Union. Apart from information in a strict sense, it has to be noted that unlike other countries that regarded Soviet internal affairs as something distant and lying rather in the field of foreign relations, the presence of the ethnic Germans compelled Germany to perceive the famine as a problem affecting directly national politics. This is related to what has been termed the trans-territorial nature of the German nation, that regarded the destiny of the large communities of Germans inhabiting Eastern Europe as a part of national life. Therefore, the famine became, to a certain extent, an issue affecting directly the Germans. This perception was strengthened also by the fact that from the inception of collectivization, a sizable flow of refugees sought to reach Germany to escape the famine. Interestingly, Germany was one of the few countries where an organized relief operation with the participation of government representatives, the operation Brüder in Not that I mentioned before, was in place. This operation acted in support of the ethnic Germans from 1933 up to the very start of the German attack on the USSR in 1941. you can see some of the pages of a final report of the Operation Brüder Note that sent aid to the ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union. And this is a quote from the same report, actually, that actually stressed that the ethnic Germans had been able actually to keep contact with Germany in the years of isolation of the Soviet Union through the relief operation Brüder Note. Among the actors that had access to information from the Soviet Union, the most relevant was the diplomatic corps. The German Foreign Office had control of the most relevant source of information, namely the diplomatic proxies. Many of the press reports that I found during my research, for example, reproduced sections of the diplomatic dispatches sent from German consuls. This points to the fact that far from establishing a monopoly on the information flow from the Soviet Union, the German Foreign Office worked as a sort of floodgate, or in other words, as a keynote of a network of information spanning from the Soviet Union to Germany. Therefore, the question arises as to the ways through which and the reasons why information gathered in the Soviet Union, reaching the Foreign Office in Berlin, was handed over by the diplomatic corps to other state and non-state actors. In order to understand this aspect, one has to consider the state of Soviet-German relations at the time of the famine. In 1933, diplomats of the Foreign Office still regarded the Rapallo policy, namely the maintenance of good relations with the Soviet Union, as a key element of the German foreign policy. Rapallo had helped Germany out of the isolation of the years following immediately World War I, had allowed also Germany to regain international prestige. In addition to this, friendship with the Soviet Union was seen as a means to deflect the possibility of a military invasion from Poland through an alliance with its major enemy, a policy that in internal documents used to be called the Rückendeckung, namely the rear cover policy. As Hitler's rise to powers threatened to strain German-Polish relations, German diplomats felt it even more important to keep in place the Soviet rear cover against Poland while getting ready for war. Hitler's rise to power between 1932 and 1933 was feared as a major threat to the Rapallo policy, since the National Socialist Party had a clear anti-Bolshevik agenda and had openly manifested its program of eastward expansion. However, in the first years of his rule, Hitler sought to posture as a moderate politician in foreign affairs. He therefore left ample room of maneuver to the Foreign Office staff and stressed continuity instead of rupture in foreign relations. His decision in May 1933 to ratify the German-Soviet Neutrality and Non-Aggression Pact that had been renewed in 1931 seemed to point in this direction. Moderation soon gave way to a more aggressive course in Hitler's foreign policy. From 1934, Hitler imposed a stronger grip on German foreign policy and irreparably soured the relations with the Soviet Union. However, this course of events was not foreseeable in 1933. Therefore, the German diplomats, especially those belonging to the so-called Russia section of the Foreign Office, initially believed in the possibility of keeping the Rapallo policy alive. This attitude by the German diplomats impacted on their politics of information about the famine in two ways. The first one was that they tried as much as possible to restrain the spreading of news on the famine in the German society. Anti-Bolshevik propaganda by several non-state organizations used evidence of the famine in campaigning against communism. For example, a protest meeting against the starving of the Germans in Russia was called out by several organizations, among them the National Socialist Party, in the summer of 1933. These campaigns put the relations with the Soviet Union under great strain, as the Bolsheviks never admitted to the existence of a famine in the country. The Foreign Office had therefore to silence these kinds of mobilizations and to avoid giving the impression that it was in any way involved in them. This austerity by the Foreign Office in distributing information about the famine had its limits, however. As all other Reich institutions, the Foreign Office conducted or supported a policy directed against the Communist Party, or the remnants of the communist movement after these had been suppressed by the Nazi government. To this end, it was important to release news about the real conditions in what the German communists idealized as a Soviet paradise, such as, for example, news about the famine. Moreover, as I say, the German Foreign Office had no monopoly of information in the German society. Therefore, it had to take into consideration the fact that the German public opinion was informed through all the channels of the catastrophe unfolding in the Soviet Union. For instance, the Brüder in Not committee, namely the committee that provided relief to the starving Germans, launched in 1933 a public collection to raise money to be sent to ethnic Germans. Booklets showing pictures of the famine were circulated among German citizens to motivate them to contribute to the collection. It was impossible, therefore, for the German Foreign Office to completely deny the existence of a famine in the Soviet Union. As a result of these two contrasting aims, namely one of keeping the Rapallo policy alive and the other of releasing information about the famine, the Foreign Office adopted a cautious strategy of spreading information and sometimes even copies of consular reports to a selected number of institutions and non-state actors, like for example the churches, to prevent any uncontrolled leaking of news. So for example, copies of consular reports were handed over to the Evangelical Church and were used to raise money for the relief operation. However, this document circulated as reports from a reliable informant, hiding their true provenance, namely the local consular proxies. And you can see an example of this one report that was circulated and was given to the churches, and the other one that was published in the press. They were both originated from German consulates in Ukraine, but they were actually published under the name of Bericht eines Augenzeugen in Kiev, so which means report from an eyewitness in Kiev. So this politics of information was to some extent successful. The German government was not particularly outspoken in denouncing the famine publicly. Several episodes related to the leaking of news about the famine strained German-Soviet relations in 1933, but they never, by themselves, led to a diplomatic crisis. Coming to the second part of my paper, namely the content of the dispatches, a second aspect of the foreign politics of I will say in the first part of my speech, actually, namely, so the effects of the politics of information by the Foreign Office on the content of the dispatch. So there is evidence, for example, that the consuls were advised by the Foreign Office to moderate their reporting on the famine in order to avoid the impression that the Soviet Union was about to collapse under the weight of unrest in the countryside. This the Russia experts of the Foreign Office did because they strove to convince the National Socialist rulers in Berlin that the Bolsheviks would remain in power in the years to come, and therefore that it was advisable to come to terms with them. The same attitude informed also the way the diplomatic reports dealt with the nationalities issue. Alfred Rosenberg, director of the Außenpolitisches Amt of the German National Socialist Party, in early writings had argued that the National Socialist Party should support the cause of the nationalities oppressed by Great Russian chauvinism. In the wake of the Nazi seizure of power, rumors that Rosenberg nurtured plans to detach Ukraine from the Soviet Union circulated in Germany and abroad. Indeed, in the first months of Nazi rule, Russian emigre circles approached the new rulers. Contacts with the NSDAP has been established already in the 20s, with the view of forging an alliance with the National Socialists in power. Therefore, the Foreign Office Russia experts, in their reporting, tried to show that the nationality factor did not play a significant role in the outbreak and the geographical distribution of the famine. So to sum up, the German Foreign Office attitude was to try to influence the perception of the famine by the National Socialist ruler and the German public opinion to ensure continuity in foreign policy. This was done by dampening to some extent the impact of the news about the famine on the German society. Turning now to the second part of my paper, the content of the diplomatic reports from the Soviet Union shows actually that German report had a number of peculiarities. By focusing mostly on Ukraine in the paper, I analyzed the cultural patterns that shaped the perception of the Great Famine by the German diplomatic corps. As pointed out by Andrea Graziosi in an article of 2004 that provides a new interpretation of the Holodomor, within the famine as a whole, we had to distinguish between two different but strongly interrelated layers. At one level, there is the general phenomenon of food insecurity and famines deriving from the particular way in which collectivization and industrialization were conducted. On a second level, there are specific phenomena, such as the dramatic acceleration of the famine in 1931-33 that hit specific areas in unprecedented measure, and the way the state tackled this crisis. German diplomats had a clear grasp of this multi-layered process. As for the first level, within the Foreign Office, the possible outcome of Soviet industrialization was largely discussed since its very inception. This is due to the fact that the Foreign Office was extremely concerned with the consequences of forced industrialization on the stability of the Soviet economic and political system. Their primary interest was that of assessing to what extent this process would affect the diplomatic and economic relations between the Soviet Union and Germany. It is no surprise then that already early on, German reports show an acute awareness that the Soviet industrialization was heading towards a major crisis. For example, in a meeting of state officials and representatives of the German IG-Farben concern in February 1930, the IG-Farben representative presented data and observations they had collected during a travel in the Soviet Union. Early on, they forecast that collectivization would result in a strong decrease in crop yields in the following spring. In their opinion, Ukraine and South Russia would suffer relatively less than other regions because of their particularly fertile soil. This expectation, as we now know, would prove completely wrong. The IG-Farben representative forecasts, however, were quite interesting and accurate in other respects. They believe, for example, that collectivization would completely disrupt agriculture and lead to a major political crisis. This crisis could manifest itself in two forms, either a military coup or a famine, which might lead to a popular uprising. However, in discussing the second outcome, most of those present came to the conclusion that the central power, quote, had the possibility to handle the situation to the effect that only local famines and local starving would take place, unquote. Thus, the Bolshevik system could have lowered the chances of a general uprising and preventing a collapse of the system itself. The outbreak of the food crisis was observed in several reports in 1932. In September 1932, for example, a report from Kharkov estimated that in contrast to what official statistics announced, the harvest had been much lower than the already low average harvest in the Soviet years. Collectivization had thrown agriculture into great disarray, especially by generating insecurity in individual peasants as to the future of the land property. Most important, the report observed that collectivization had aroused in the peasants a negative attitude towards their work, which had resulted in decreasing agricultural outputs. In the same month, a report of an economic expert at the German embassy in Moscow stressed, quote, "Predictably, the food situation of the mass of the population in winter and spring will become very difficult," unquote. A common trait of the memoranda written after the inception of collectivization is the clear understanding that the major factor in the whole process was the human factor, namely the attitude of the peasants toward collectivization. Very early on, German diplomats understood that behind the mere economic problems, there was a struggle between the state and the peasants. The peasants resisted collectivization as they perceived it as a form of serfdom. In their reports, German diplomats provided different views of the struggle. Some of them pointed to an intentional resistance by the peasants in response to the war waged by the Bolshevik system against them. In some cases, diplomats manifested sympathy with the peasant world, especially when talking about the German peasants. In most reports, however, they showed understanding for the necessities that had forced the Soviet rulers to start modernization from above. Also, they criticized the specific way the Bolshevik leadership has steered the process of industrialization. Many reports underscore that peasant resistance was the product of their backward mentality, of their natural indolence, or their deeply entrenched individualistic mindsets, attitudes that prevented them from fully adapting to modernization. The German consul in Kassel, for example, wrote in December 1933 that the cause of the famine was that the regime had decided to carry out collectivization too early, too fast, and with insufficient means, thus throwing agriculture into great disarray and, besides other factors, overlooking the fact that, according to Stalin himself, the man decided over the thing, disregarding the issue whether 22 million Ukrainian peasants would follow him and whether they would show understanding for and collaboration with the new collective economic form, instead of their deep-rooted individualistic ideology. To a certain extent, it can be said that though despising Bolshevism as a political system, German diplomats share the view of the Bolsheviks towards the peasant world as a site of backwardness, and somehow even admire their ability to modernize the country in such short span of time. In this, they were not alone. In an article that I'm about to publish in a special issue of the Nationality Papers, I analyzed German, Italian, Polish, and British diplomatic documents, coming to the conclusion that all of them share this attitude towards Soviet modernization. On the whole, German reports do not display a complete aversion towards the countryside, but rather a sort of idealization of the good peasant embodied by the German colonists perceptive to modernization, as opposed to the huge mass of the backward Slavic peasants. A key figure in the history of the German perception of the Great Famine is the attaché for agricultural issues at the German embassy in Moscow, Otto Schiller. Schiller had a long experience in Soviet affairs and entertained intense contacts with the networks of cultural associations that goes under the name of Ostforschungs. He reported constantly to Berlin data on the development of Soviet agriculture, collecting during long trips he made with his own car. Traveling in this way, he was able to circumvent the control of the Soviet authorities and to interview the peasants directly, gaining from them first-hand information not available in the press. This led to several conflicts with the Soviet authorities, even if Schiller tried as much as possible to avoid such contrast, as he was threatened with expulsion several times. In his memoranda, Schiller described in great detail the dire conditions of the peasants and the depopulation of entire regions. He also applied a strongly analytical approach, comparing systematically, for example, the intensity of the famine in different regions and tried to make sense of these variations. In his opinion, for example, a major reason for a difference in death rates was a different cultural and economic development achieved by the population of the different areas and between different ethnic groups within the same area. In Ukraine, for example, Schiller noted that the German colonists had been less hardly hit by the famine than the Russian and the Ukrainian peasants. In his opinion, this was to be explained with the fact that the German individual peasants had accumulated capital stock in the previous years. So when the famine had broken out, they had been able to sell these assets, acquiring the means to survive for a longer time than others to the food crisis. A major factor Schiller recognized between such variations was a political one. For Schiller, for example, the difference in mortality rates between Ukraine and North Caucasus had to be explained with political factors. According to his estimates, being hit more severely, North Caucasus, according to his estimates, had been hit more severely than Ukraine. In this view, one of the causes of this variation in the geographical distribution of the starving was what he termed a political use of the famine. There is an intentional strategy of food denial to break down resistance. The region that had suffered more were those where a compact anti-Soviet attitude was present, as for example in the Cossack region of North Caucasus. Here, decrease in agricultural output had combined with large deportations of the population that, engendering a shortage of workforce, had completely disrupted agriculture. In conclusion, it can be said that German diplomats had a clear grasp of the multi-layer nature of the Greek-Soviet famines, being able to observe the famine for a very close perspective, namely the diplomatic posts, especially those in Ukraine. Germany had a sophisticated understanding of the processual character of the famine that was the result of both structural factors and intentional decisions. Besides seeing that the great famines were the product of collectivization, they were able also to recognize the role of human agency, especially from the part of the peasants. Human agency behind the mere economic processes. On the other hand, cultural patterns, for example, stereotyping about the Slavic character of the Soviet peasants and the master nation mentality towards, for example, Ukrainian nationalism, hindered the Germans to recognize some of the key features of the famine. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Sorry. I'll now invite Iryna Dmytrychyn from the Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales in Paris to come to the podium. Her talk today is entitled Voyage, enchanté d'Eduard Herriot, or The Enchanted Voyage of Eduard Herriot.
Thank you. Eduard Herriot, a prominent French politician, president of parliament, mayor of Lyon, went to the Soviet Union on September 1933. He stayed in Ukraine 5 days, from the 26th to the 30th of August, out of a total of 15 days in the USSR. He arrived in Odessa, then Kyiv, Kharkiv, the capital of Ukraine at the time, visited the Dnipro Dam, and then he went to Moscow, where he spent the most of his trip. The trip was made at rushing tempo, one city per day, night being reserved for the moving by train, where 2 wagons were made available at his disposal. Along the way, he saw kolkhozes, factories, museums, honored banquets, and shook hands. Here you have the photos from the Ukrainian press. At the time when the workers' delegations were going to the USSR continuously, followed by the distinguished guest, the trip of a prominent Western politician was available. The decision to invite Herriot was taken by the Soviet embassy in Paris in June 1933 because of its great Franco-Soviet and even international political importance. Indeed, accessing to the national policy, Herriot was always been in favor of the USSR and never failed to underline it. Released from his governmental obligation after the fall of his cabinet, Eduard Herriot made his trip privately, even it was obvious that he would return to the big politics. The parenthesis also allowed to circumvent the protest that would have invariably raised an official trip if it could have even taken place. It is probably his move to Sofia in August 1933 for a congress of radical parties, an occasion to which he will also visit Greece and Turkey, that gave the idea of going to the USSR by the Black Sea. The French diplomacy, which from the beginnings of the collectivization received from the embassy in Moscow the information on its progress, its failures, and its turnarounds, was warned about the issue of the famine since spring 1932, the peasant uprisings in Ukraine, the convictions of senior officials of the Commissariat for Agriculture, etc., when Herriot was Minister of Foreign Affairs and during the year of 1933 before his departure. The precision and lucidity of the dispatches sent by the French ambassador Herbert Dejean allowed to consider that the French decision makers were fully informed of the situation in Ukraine. While the French press was not very interested in the Soviet agriculture, for the communist press, the life of the kolkhozes was idyllic. Here you have the dinner in the Ukrainian peasant house. Vaillant Couturier, one of leader of French Communist Party. Here his book about Ukraine and Caucasus. Here you have photos, and everything was in this way. As was the question of famine, it was treated accordingly to political affiliations. Ignored or questioned in the communist or leftist press, it was present in anti-communist or right-wing publications. The subject thus joined the global cleavage around the USSR. Beyond the facts, it was a matter of faith. Eduard Herriot's trip has been meticulously prepared. After choosing the candidate, the embassy services provided precise reports on Herriot's personality, his career, and even his readings. To deny the existence of the famine in Ukraine was among the main objectives of the invitation of Eduard Herriot. In Moscow, the preparation was supervised by Stalin himself, as evidenced by his correspondence with Kaganovich, to lead eventually to a visit settled as a music paper. Thanks to archival documents, we know that nothing has been left to chance between the choice of routes, interpreters, hotels, and places to visit, protocol nuances, the right tone to adopt, etc. Herriot was closely watched, and a real cordon sanitaire around him was organized from the moment he was on the boat. Once in Ukraine, foreign diplomats were kept out of the way, making it impossible for them to contact Herriot. The receptions were organized on the sites, as well as the crowds who applauded him as he passed. The famine-ravaged cities of Kyiv and Kharkiv have been cleaned up. We can follow the journey step by step through the press, French and Soviet, Central and Ukrainian. We also have reports from the security services that allow us to look behind the scene. The testimonies of those who attended as spectators complete the picture, of which the only thing missing is the intimate stratum, in other words, the perception of Herriot himself, apart from public and official statements. While in August 21st, 5 days before his arrival, Soviets were still wondering about the possibility of visiting a kolkhoz, I quote, given the state of the economy in this sector, Herriot finally visited 2 collective farms in Ukraine, Chervony Promeny, Krasny Luch in Russian, in the village Bilayevka, 45 kilometers from Odessa, and the international commune in the village of Khortytsa, in the southeast of Ukraine. In Bilayevka, according to the GPU chief of Odessa, everything he saw in the collective farm made a good impression. Herriot had a collective woman farmer sit by his side, kissed everyone, led himself to photographers and operators, joked and savored a good lunch at a peasant house. He left after a few hours with 2 embroidered rushniks, while 18 embroidery shirts brought from the NKVD were offered to him as he was boarding the train leaving Odessa for Kiev. Herriot was asking questions, touching the bags to make sure they contained grains, and showing satisfaction at the answers, writing them down in his little notebook. Overall, Herriot has been a very accommodating host. The fears of Soviet officials who gave themselves so much trouble were useless. What they did not manage to hide from Herriot, he managed to hide it from France. If we cannot blame him for the reception and staging by the Soviets, the close surveillance of which he was the subject, he still cannot be cleared. And the first of the responsibilities, undeniable, resides in his protest of objectivity and total freedom which he would have enjoyed during his displacement and that he always put forward in his declarations. In fact, from the outset, Herriot was manipulator as much as manipulated. For when he declared, "Before my departure I was given the name of a village afflicted by the plague," he lied twice. No one told him about a village, and the famine was not confined to a village, just as the word plague is a misnomer, softening or even hiding reality. At his return, Herriot gave numerous interviews and lectures, making favorable commentaries about the USSR. Regarding famine, his remarks have undergone a significant evolution. When asked about the Soviet agricultural system when he was in Moscow, Herriot declared that he could not speak, having seen only 1 sovkhoz and 2 kolkhozes of unequal value. The first time that he reacted on the subject was outside the Soviet borders, in Riga, declaring, "The Russian famine, I do not believe in it." When he got off the train in Paris in September of 14th, he displayed vocabulary treasures on this subject. So you can see, comparing Ukraine to the garden in full bloom. At the banquet of Radical Party of September the 17th, he was more offensive on the topic, warning against slanders against a formidable people who industrialize, targeting Germany without naming it. On September the 19th, during the Vichy address, Herriot was even more explicit about what would be behind the information about the famine. The Russian famine, which is agitated like a scarecrow, is only the suspect product of Hitler's propaganda. Thus, Herriot sweeps aside the question of famine, arguing the industrial achievements of the Soviet Union, but also by laying charges against those who seek to colonize Ukraine. His finger was pointing towards Berlin, who accused him by the press of being fooled by the Soviet authorities. Herriot turned the argument in his favor. If Hitler's Germany is unhappy, it means that he is on the right track. This argument was unstoppable at the time in 1933. On the famine issue, Herriot was completely taken over the Soviet thesis, fact which the interested parties were already convinced on the spot, as testifies Velichko's report. One can legitimately ask to what extent these internal Soviet documents are to be taken literally, knowing that the author was responsible for the success and therefore had even unconsciously to provide the images masked in the right direction. However, in view of the result obtained, Herriot's statements on the subject of famine, we must admit that the mission of persuasion was fully successful. The true triumph, however, came with this letter from Herriot, addressed from Lyon on September the 21st, 1933, to Guelfond, the Gepeu's eye and his personal companion on the trip. In this letter, Herriot thanks first of all Guilfond and asking him for the proofs of on the alleged famine in Ukraine. He's speaking about a photo, and I found this photo. It was the photo from the German brochure Bruder in Not, and the photo, it was the, this photo with a child with a very big head. There is no information when following the request. Its existence alone shows Herriot's willful involvement in the famine negation enterprise in Ukraine. From now, the name of Eduard Herriot and his declarations served as reference in the debate of the famine, provoking the protests and the stupor of some. And here you have one example from Charles de Perret-Chapuis and the great French, very balanced weekly order. And then on the other side, in the communist press, his name was used to underline the success of Soviet Union. Eduard Herriot's trip provoked many reactions in Ukrainian and Russian emigration circles, at the time composed of tens of thousands of people, including a large number of intellectuals and politicians who intended to continue to fight against the Moscow of Lenin and Stalin. The two emigrations did not join their efforts, and their reactions on the trip were not quite identical. Russian emigration had engaged in a controversy with Herriot through its press organ, the daily Возрождение. Herriot responded with barely veiled arguments and accusations towards German intrigue. The Ukrainian emigrations to France alerted on the famine through its publication, Trident, Trezub, while Alexander Shulgin gave a great interview to Figaro. References to Herriot were explicit but cautious. The different Ukrainian communities in Europe have fought on the international scene in Geneva within the International Red Cross and the League of Nations with its various bodies, including the Office of National Minorities and the Committee of International Women's Organizations. The dealing in these organizations were complicated, and Herriot's name was evoked as a counter-argument to question the existence of the famine. But international organizations have not done anything, and still, concluded the newspaper Le Matin, Geneva has therefore encountered inevitable procedural difficulties. The Ukrainian magazine of Paris was lucid and farsighted as for the outcome of his fight on the international scene. None of the people who traveled with Herriot didn't contradict it. He was accompanied by two deputies, two senators, and no one thought nothing different of what said Herriot. Ambassador Alphonse, Herriot's chief of staff at the Quai d'Orsay and appointed by him to Moscow, was all for the cause of the rapprochement. In his dispatches, Alphonse was leading the ministry away from famine. There would have been at most only a few difficulties, an imbalance which the peasants themselves would be responsible for, all hatched by Hitler's Germany. Of the two journalists of the delegation, only Georges Luciani went to Ukraine. He seems to have been totally caught in the mystification, judging by his articles in Le Petit Parisien and Le Temps. Geneviève Tabouy joined Herriot in Russia, and it is the Moscow society that had become the focus of his truly stunning reports. Nevertheless, she devotes several articles to Ukraine and the harvest, joining Herriot in the famine negation enterprise. Eduard Herriot published a book only a few months after his return, in March 1934, at Hachette. L'Orient tells the story of its journey between Turkey, the Soviet Union, and Latvia. Ukraine occupies chapter 7, 29 pages, out of a total of 418. Before tackling the collective farms visit, Herriot explains the Soviet agricultural organization and the difference between collective farms, sovkhozes, and individual enterprises. It seems to take the memos provided by the authorities. The story of the visit is lyrical and moving, with a profusion of details, and above all, the affirmation of the abundance of the harvest. We do not know where to house the grains. There are also descriptions of the peasant houses with a radio and portraits of Stalin and Lenin, the Udarnik's brigades, and their work of educating the peasants. In these kolkhozes descriptions, there is everything to reassure a French spirit: a good organization, the freedom of movement, the sanctions of abuses. Everything is logical and clear: paid work, protected peasant. It's so much more relieving than visualizing scenes of food requisitions and cannibalism, deportations, slave labors, and images of death and starvation. However, what drove Herriot to make French believe the omnipresence of machines in the Ukrainian countryside or the existence of Red Cross posts during the harvests? Didn't he have the slightest doubt of a staging, no suspicion of the love of the chiefs whose portraits, as we are sure, he could see everywhere? This book, which preface is written in March 1934, can be considered as the official record and the main source of his journey as he wished to present it. The message that Herriot wanted to deliver should be searched for in this book. Eduard Herriot needed this trip and the recognition, national and international, that his success was likely to procure him. The USSR sought to assert the radiant image of the country led by a victorious regime, worthy to join the concert of nations, and to silence the rumors of famine. Both were interested in making the trip successful, and no one was looking for controversy. Eduard Herriot's journey in the Soviet Union was in itself a beautiful conquest. His silence would have been a victory. His denial of famine was a triumph. Herriot was engaged in a flight ahead, and the Soviets were wrong to worry. What they could not hide, the favorable optics of Herriot erased it. The goal sought by the Stalin regime would not have been fully achieved without this kindly participation, voluntary or involuntary, of Eduard Herriot. His personality was used, his testimony was instrumentalized, but did not he lend himself to it with his guilty indulgence? Herriot agreed to play a role in the show organized for him and of which he was one of the extras. Without him, without the part he played on his return, the success of the sinister staging would not have worked with as much success. His journey to the Soviet Union, whose art archives nearly 30 years after the fall of the regime are still not accessible, is not known in the slightest of circumstances. However, the available evidence, the efforts to mislead him, or the political imperatives to which he believed he should submit, cannot absolve Herriot of his responsibility for the final result. If it is probable that he has not seen much, it is certain that it suited him. The problem doesn't lay in the fact that he didn't see. More serious is the fact of having claimed that the famine had never existed. Moreover, Herriot claimed that the famine was a product of propaganda. Even if it is a suggested lie, Herriot has fully adopted it and didn't question it. His name was evoked henceforth to be thrown in the face of all those who tried to speak of the famine. He never denied it. Eduard Herriot undertook the journey with two ideas: peace and rapprochement with the USSR, or rather an idea of peace that came through the rapprochement with the USSR. He saw enough things to have doubts, but the mental sorter of which Koestler spoke has done his work. Neither the observed incurabilities nor the observed images could have diverted him from what he believed, let him do this credit, to be in the interest of France. For political motives and personal ambition was added the Franco-Soviet economic agreement, whose fate was played at the precise moment of this travel and which had been discussed for many years already. A protocol to the provisional trade agreement was signed at the Quai d'Orsay on August 26, 1933, the same day that Herriot landed in Odessa. He pleaded in Odessa for the establishment of a Marseille-Odessa link. The boats would have brought in the USSR phosphates from Algeria and returned to France loaded with Ukrainian durum grains. Indeed, to admit the existence of a famine did not coincide with these projects. One can wonder to what extent Herriot was permeable to Soviet rhetoric, which was constantly referring to the French Revolution and the ideal of a social progress, which spoke only of an oppressive kulak. Would he have been less voluntarily blind if it was not so-called dominant class? Many minds of this time considered that the birth of the new world could not be done without suffering an error. They were convinced that the Soviet Union was concerned only with the resistance of some backward elements, human debris, as said Louis Aragon, guilty of in the first place of not understanding the course of history. Dehumanization, the kulaks, was a weapon on the ideological arsenal. Assimilated to abject beings, their disappearance ceased to be a great loss. One may wonder to what extent the look on Russia as a country of recurrent famines could have played in its acceptance of famine in 1933. Had it more easily agreed to trivialize the famine, to look at it as an inevitable scourge, by the fact that the famine of 1922 was only separated in time by a dozen years. His bad knowledge of ancient Russia that he abusively transposed to the USSR no doubt also pushed him there. Eduard Herriot's choices and France's position in the Soviet question cannot be regarded and especially understood without taking into account the European situation. The advent of Hitler disrupts Europe, creating threats and materializing fears of a new war. The Franco-Soviet rapprochement takes an anti-German turn in the middle of the year 1933. From the 1934, the French political scene, shaken in February, is dominated by the principle of unity of anti-fascist action, carefully avoiding any criticism of Stalinism or even any question. Defend the USSR means to fight Nazis. To undermine it is to support Hitler's regime. Between the blind and naive, the convinced partisans and the strategists of the lesser evil, the declarations of Eduard Herriot, if not before and contribute to the movement, at least marry him perfectly. Therefore, there will be no one on the French political scene to talk about famine. The question is outdated and future dangers justify forgetting. If we do not know, and we will probably never know how much Herriot believed what was told him about the objections of the kulaks and the happiness of the collective farm life, in the absence of document trace, a certainty was forged all throughout this investigation. Herriot knew. His silence is not a proof of his ignorance. To the contrary. Eduard Herriot raises the question of responsibility of the politician, and his choices were to the error borders on criminal complicity. Fortified by his status as an eyewitness, Herriot looked up all those who tried to tell the truth or helped starving people in the camp of Nazi supporters, making them suspicious at best. He endorsed the tactics of the Soviet Union, showing great help of the regime. The Stalinist propaganda machine would no doubt have succeeded even if Herriot had told the truth. But his success would not have been complete without these enchanted pilgrims, among whom Herriot occupies a place of choice. We have at least two proofs that history prevented the arrival of relief and had consequences likely to amplify the human disaster. In a report to the Sûreté on the Congress of National Minority in Bern, we learn that the Soviet Union was inclined to recognize famine by explaining it by the disorder of transport and the activity of saboteurs. But it was, stresses the report in parentheses, before Herriot's visit. Similarly, in debates on the Red Cross, his denials were an argument of sufficient weight to counterbalance many alarmist voices. Undoubtedly, the situation of famine in August-September 1933, attenuated by the harvest, was no longer on its peak. Herriot, however, managed to prevent the arrival of relief. Even by the end of 1933, the help could have relieved, saved lives. And essential, at the time, no one could know when the famine was going to stop. Moreover, the efforts to help were maintained, and in 1935, one of those who incited international organizations to act argued that the words of Mr. Herriot constitute to this day a serious impediment for all people who, moved by humanitarian considerations, fight to spread the truth and help those suffering from famine in the Soviet Union. And finally, Robert Conquest spoke about Eduard Herriot's irresponsibility. The French philosopher Raymond Aron circumscribed the Occidental admiration for the Soviet regime by three aspects: political irresponsibility, scientific misconception, and moral fault. a statement that suits Herriot perfectly. Thank you. And I would like just to show you, there were many humoristical pictures and rather in left press and the right-wing press, and here you have some image from the anti-communist press, and the legend is, Mr. Herriot, if you want, we can drive slowly, more, not so fast. Another one, Mr. Herriot, you see the Black Sea. Before the revolution, it was a pool of water and not a Black Sea. And the Herriot's village, like a Potemkin village. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so our final speaker is Eduard Baidaus, who teaches at Red Deer College and Lakeland Community College. And his topic today is Soviet collectivization and the Holodomor in Ukraine, primary source materials in Romania and Moldova.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for this invitation. It's my pleasure and honor to be here. Lots of things to learn. I thought will be 4 of us.
There's 3 of you presenting, and then there's a commentator.
All right. Okay. Between Poland and, should I stick with the, okay. I used to.
He's a walker.
Sort of. All right. Some room here. Between Poland and Soviet Union, there were political relations when World War I ended, when they had the war in 1919, 2021, and Poles and Soviets, they were not friends, we know, right? But they did have diplomatic relations. With Romania was a different case, not diplomatic relations, which didn't mean at all that there were no relations between Romania and Soviet Union. So my presentation it's focused on primary sources in Romania and in Moldova, and the conference is focused most on those archives and other sites outside of Soviet Union. But because Moldova was part of Soviet Union, but before 1940 it was part of Romania, so it's both Moldova and Romania, and I have serious reason to use both countries as examples. I have a quick outline, a map, Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, somewhere here. I'll speak quickly about some objectives of this paper, historical context, why it is important, because when we speak of famine, Holodomor, Soviet policies, we don't think only about 1929, 1933. We look a bit early. We can try even look into another famine at the end of 1800s in Russia when about 500,000 people died, also during peacetime. So it's all connected. Then why does Romania and Moldova matter? Then I will speak of archives in Romania and Moldova, about published sources, secondary and primary sources in both countries, and Romania's interwar newspapers and periodicals. And then I have a few interesting things to say about if you go to work in Romania and Moldova, it's good to know some of the tricks and realities which you may face. I mean, it's not about Romania, because I went to Moscow, I went to Poland, Kiev. It's everywhere there is something you have to know about, right? So, okay. The goal, as I said, is to focus on less known, almost unknown sources and sites which have lots of documents related to interwar relations between Soviet Union and Romania, but not only. And the focus is, of course, on famine and on Holodomor. And my point is there are tons of documents everywhere. We know that. By the way, I'm the beginner in this research topic. Usually, I did previously other research. Now I'm undertaking a new project which is focused on Holodomor. So, and I'm sure for the things I saw, and I hope I will see again, and even more, there is a lot to discover and to use, which will bring some more lights or a different prospect over Holodomor in neighboring to Romania, Soviet Ukraine. So very important is a context about Romanian relations with the Soviet Union and before. We know World War I, Romania and Russia were allies for a short time, then Russia in turmoil, civil war and so on. And then you have Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, two different political systems, and about some post-war realities, relations between People's Republic of Ukraine and Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Union, and the relations were strained, were not good at all between 1918 until 1940. And we know what did happen in 1939, 1940 with some countries in Eastern Europe, with Poland, Romania, Finland, Baltic states, and so on. Well, Romania's days, we know that Romania was ruled by a Hohenzollern man, Karol de Hohenzollern, so he was German, but he wasn't a German at the same time, so he took the side of Entente. So Ukraine, relations between People's Republic of Ukraine and Romania were not so quite good and friendly, and one of the problems was the land. It was about Bessarabia and Bukovina. Each country saw this land as either Ukrainian or populated by Ukrainians or by Romanians. But we know that Ukraine, People's Republic of Ukraine had a dramatic fate, it disappeared, and then the relations between Romania and Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Union were not good also because of dispute over Bessarabia and Bukovina, conflicting ideologies, Soviet revanchism, as I say, partisans and enemies living in both countries, borders, violators and defectors, and Romanian national treasure. So here is the map of Soviet Union, Poland, and Romania. It's a huge border. It's not so large like Polish one, but still it's a huge portion of the common border both countries shared. So very quickly, Bessarabia was part of Moldavian Principality. In 1812, Russians took over this land from the Ottomans. Then in 1817, Bessarabia was proclaimed a democratic republic. And then, because Ukraine proclaimed its independence from Russia, Romanians or Moldovans, they did the same thing. But very soon in 1918, Bessarabia voted union with Romania, which is also a very sensitive question. So this is Moldavia, and this is Bessarabia, Eastern Moldova, and Bukovina. So conflicted ideologies. I won't be talking too much about conflicted ideologies between two countries. We know it was communism and it was socialism in Soviet Union. Long live the king in one country and glory to the party and Stalin in another country. Christianity and atheism and with differences. And society and economy, free versus totalitarian. Well, maybe Romanian society wasn't free as is today in Europe, but comparing with Stalin's Soviet Union, it was free society. Capitalism versus socialism, and the question of the land, which was very important. The approach towards the problem of land was different. Well, we know that Lenin signed a decree of the land, and peasants in former Russian Empire, they received land until Stalin collectivized the land in the collective farms, right? But Romania was a different situation. Romanian authorities were afraid that peasants will rebel because there was a huge rebellion in Romania for the land in 1907. And to avoid the spread of communism, Bolshevism into Romania, they decided, well, let's take the land from the landowners and to give to the peasants. Of course, the peasants had to pay for about 30 years for this land, but only in Bessarabia, more than 1 million hectares were expropriated and given to peasants. And it wasn't the same, of course, in Soviet Union by end of 1920s, early 1930s. So another problem which made the relations between Romania and Soviet Union be problematic, it was because of this Piedmont principle. They created a Moldavian autonomous republic in southwestern Ukraine. So with the idea, we'll get Bessarabia back because everyone is Moldovan and so on. But they had another project in 1918, if I'm not 1919. They created Bessarabian Soviet Republic with a capital in cities in Odessa and then in Tiraspol. either project didn't work properly, but nonetheless, the Soviet official borderline was on the Prut River. Official, because Soviet maps showed Bessarabia as part of Soviet Ukraine, and the border was on the Prut. But de facto, the border was on the Dnieper, and right here, this dark yellow color is the Soviet Moldovan Autonomous Republic, the Soviet Piedmont, so to say. Then what else? There were people who moved out Romania into Soviet Union and people who moved from Soviet Union to Romania. And this also wasn't seen by both sides as a positive thing because those people were acting against those regimes. So let's say Romanians in Soviet Union, Dmytrychyn, he was a Red Army commissar, he was fighting against People's Republic of Ukraine, he was an architect of Moldovan Autonomous Republic. Well, he ended bad as many others. In 1938, he was executed by an order of Stalin. Another person is Cristian Rakovski, who was leader of socialist movement in Romania, even though he was a Bulgarian, okay? But she was head of Radnarkom in Soviet Ukraine. So also involved in Ukrainian-Romanian relations and so on. He was executed in 1941. Now people, why Soviets were not happy with the Romanians being enemies. There were many Ukrainians who moved out of Ukraine because of Soviet Bolshevism. And I have two people here only, Batka Makhno, Nestor Makhno. Bucharest refused to give up and to extradite Makhno to the Soviets. Of course, Makhno, afterwards, he moved out from Romania, but Romanians were the first to say, well, we will not give up, and this person is free to stay in Romania as much as he wants. The second person is Hnat Pokrovsky. He was a commander in Petlura army, and then he joined Romanian intelligence for more than 20 years. He also ended not nice at all. He was caught by Smersh during the World War II, and he was sent to Gulag, and it said that he died in 1949. What else? Boundaries violators and defectors. Prior to Holodomor in 1920s, from Romania into USSR, who moved? Sympathizers of Soviet Union, socialists, communists, ordinary people, criminals, peasants, any nationality or ethnicity, not only Romanians or Jews or Ukrainians or Russians. And also, there were enemies of the USSR, Romanian spies who were sent by Romanian authorities just to check what is going on in neighborhood Romania, in neighborhood Soviet Union and Soviet Ukraine. Romania were in very good relations with the French and British before they joined Stalin, so it was a good network of exchanging information from Romania. And this image shows a Soviet border guard in search of traitors, maybe. So from USSR to Romania, aristocrats, many left, and they escaped from that, so to say, Soviet paradise into Romania or into Poland, the Baltic states. One of them was Princess Tatiana Konstantinovna Romanova. She remained alive because she moved out of Russia. Or political enemies, military, ordinary people. Why they moved out? Because of civil war, because of chaos, because of bands, gangs, famine, because of pogroms and so on. Also, who moved into Romania, Bolshevik spies, agents, and propagandists, because they wanted to spread the world of the communist paradise into Romania, because they wanted to make Romania part of this revolution, world revolution, and Dmytrychyn was one of them who was working to make Romania as a communist country. He failed, as many others, but not after World War II. So now another problem, very important for Romanian government back in decades and even now, is Romanian treasure. When Germans took over almost all Romania in 1916, by 1917, they moved all the national treasure into Russia, into Moscow. And you can see here that, I'm not going to read everything, but only 93 tons of gold. Gold, pure gold. What to say about archives, antique valuables, paintings, icons. The value of today is about 3 billion euro or 4.5 billion Canadian dollars. So that's a lot. What the fate was, they restored something to the Romanian government, but not the gold. Some of the archives were restored. And it was during 2008 when it was one of the most serious attempts of Romanian government to take as much as possible from the Russian government. And the president of Russia, well, he didn't say directly no. He said, let them work on this. And they still work. It's 2019. Nothing is back. So Holodomor studies, why Romania and Moldova matters. First of all, common border. We know that. Common border with Poland, common border with the Baltic states, with Finland. But it's Ukraine, and it's Poland, and it's Romania. And it's Bessarabia, part of Romania. Unexplored archives, libraries, under-research sources, unknown document collections, and also secondary sources, lesser-known historiography articles, collection of documents, and so on and so on. And the problem is, the majority of them, 99%, are published in Romanian language. So I'm going to just go very quick what I did find and what I want to explore on. So, okay, the question is, what information and data can be found in Romania? Soviet domestic and foreign policies, collectivization, famine, persecution, who, when, how, and why left USSR for Romania? What was the fate of the defectors after crossing the border? Who and why was and why was not allowed to stay in Romania? Information Romanians were interested in collecting from the refugees. Bucharest reactions to an attitude towards the knowledge of Holodomor. Romanian general public opinion and perception of the Soviet defectors. What political parties, politicians, and political figures expressed concerns about the situation in Soviet Ukraine, and what did they do in this regard? What can else be found in Romanian archives? Materials and records of diplomats and other foreign countries' representatives, Romanian border guards, department and police, Siguranța, intelligence service, ministries of war, education, justice, labor, health, and public protection. It sounds strange, but I found interesting things in those archives and files. National Security of Red Cross, National Society of Red Cross, the Immigration Service, Transnistrian Refugees Association Committee, Transnistrian Refugee Society, Ethnic Minorities Associations, their records, Ukrainian and Jews. What else? I have here a few records inventory examples. Records of the Ukrainian Society Prosvita, and you can see the years. Correspondence of Society of Ukrainian Studies. Siguranța Memories, which is Romanian Intelligence Service. Soviet refugees into Romania. Economic and political situation in USSR, 2635. Transnistria refugees instructions. Notes and information from the USSR. Trip to Russia, notes. Border with Soviet Ukraine. Notes from Bessarabia and Bukovina, 1930, 32, 33, and so on. So another examples, the agricultural situation in Soviet Union, 1932. Situation at the Dniester River, information of the Soviet Western Border Alliance. Notes and reports about the USSR. Foreign ships in Constanța. Frontier, Tigina, Dniester River notes, 33, 39. Information bulletins about the situation in USSR, 1934. Russian refugees in Romania. When I say Russian, when they write Russian, it's meant from the Soviet Union, but it wasn't Soviet Union. To them, it was Russia still. The NKVD reports, 1935. Now, very quick about collectivization and famine in Romanian and Moldovan archives. And here you can see kids dying from famine and bodyguards guarding the border of the Dniester River. So I will quickly to those archives I've been in, and I work in some of them, and I collected information. National Archives of Romania. You can see here the links: public services, research, local, regional archives, contact information. Everything is here. I will provide organizers with the latest draft of my presentation, so you can benefit from those links, or just may contact me. National Archives of Romania, archival funds of the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Education, Internal Affairs, Directorate of Police and General Safety. And there's also a link, because when they saw those people, thousands moving from Soviet Union and into Romania, they talked to them, they discussed with them various issues. And there's a lot of information because everyone needed a house, everyone had kids, they had to go to school, and it's all recorded. Archives of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania as well, opening hours, other holdings, conditions, and everything you need to know before you go to that place. National military archives as well, and when you go over there, like in many other places, you have to fill in a form and to request the permission to work in those archives. And here are the links and contacts. It's in Romanian, but I'm sure they do speak English and French, at least. So another thing, I haven't been at the Securitate, which is, let's say, Romanian KGB archives, but I found very interesting information about this place, funds, library, manuscripts, contact information, all is here. And I thought, well, it's a Securitate, it's a time of communist Romania. But when I looked into, I found the following information. So you can see Bucharest phone inventory, files on Bessarabians and others who left the USSR after 1917 until 1950, between 25 and 56. Espionage, acts of sabotage, provocations, and terror on Romanian soil. You see the Dniester River Transportation and Navigation Society in Bucharest with information. The trafficking of refugees over the Dniester River in the 30s. Refugees, smuggling of goods across the Dniester River, and so on and so on. And there is a source, there's a PDF file. You can access it and look inside what they have over there. So now about Moldova. I thought in the beginning, well, I will find nothing in Moldova, but there is a lot in Moldova as well. Files and everything which can relieve information about Holodomor, and records of machine and tractor stations, NKVD, defectors to and from Romania, and also Siguranța files. And in Moldova, there are two main archives. It's a National Agency of Archives and the Archives of Social Political Organizations. And there I found Siguranța Romanian documents which were taken by or preserved by the Soviets. And this file, for instance, says about all those who tried to move from Soviet Union into Romania in 1930 and 1932. And also, there is a former KGB or CIS organization in Moldova. They also have archives, and I believe there something could be found over there as well. I'm not sure about free access, but it's the same procedure. You write a letter, say who you are, what you do, and they may or may not, depending who is in the power, let you go to work in that archive. So lots of publications, but one of the best one I would say, it's about famine, Petilietка, and collective farm documents, diplomatic documents in Romania, 1926-36. Then there is another book, The Mass Killing During the Great Purge in Moldovan Autonomous Republic. And it's about the years 37 and 38, and I work with the first volume. It has lots of information about Holodomor as well. So Romanian newspapers, interwar time, a lot of information. What did they publish? Because they interview people, they wanted to know what is going on. And I focused on two main locations, Bessarabia itself, the border with Soviet Ukraine, and Bucharest as a capital town. So also the links and...
Perfect.
Yes. And concluding, so when you think and you want to go to work in Romania, it's good to know what you may find over there and what issues you may have to face. And I have here three books. This one can be accessed easily in any library in the West. This one you can take it in Moldova already. There are guides how to work in the libraries, and this in the archives. And this one is a guide of Romanian archives, and there is a PDF link here as well. So it's good to be aware of. In Romania it was a bit different. In Moldova, just 1 minute, and I'm done.
Yeah, we're almost out of time. And we
yeah, I know. Just this is almost the last slide. So when you have to pay for the benefit of using those files, and you go to the bank to pay. That's not a problem. It's not expensive. And they'll give you a special paper, so you'll fill in the form. You go to bank, and here is the problem. Because if you aren't a citizen of the Republic of Moldova, you cannot pay, because it's a requirement to pay using your Moldovan ID in that machine. And I said, okay, what if I don't have these documents? What if I'm a foreigner from outer space? I said, it's not our problem. So I talked with a person from Hungary, and he said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, I asked someone, and they helped me to pay. But the thing is, when you pay, it's about taxes. All this information goes to that person, taxation. I don't know, I cannot find the answer why they do so, but this is one of the problems you may face if you go to Moldova, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduard. And now we'll invite Olga Bertelsen from the Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University to give us a few comments and start our discussion.
Thank you very much, Heather. Good afternoon, everybody. First, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor, it's a pleasure to be part of this wonderful event. When I was reading these three papers, I was thinking that, first of all, we sort of expand the topic. I mean, and generally speaking, this Holodomor studies in terms of thematically and chronologically and in many other respects. But first let me share with you, I think, a couple of general observations. I think that the general story of the Holodomor has been told. However, these three papers by our speakers, I think, have demonstrated with absolute clarity that incremental changes and additions to this sort of master narrative of the Holodomor occurring through systematic research and a discovery of new archival documents are extremely important, are very valuable, and they help us construct a more nuanced story of the Holodomor, the history of the Holodomor, of the past. And in the case, I believe in the case of the Holodomor, it's even more so, because the Soviet politics of silence, and not only the Soviet politics of silence, later the Russian politics of silence, systematically erased the narrative about mass killings by hunger from history books, and thus from the national memory of several generations of people in Ukraine and beyond. Second, research conducted by our three speakers highlight disagreements, actually, and a divide, I would say, between two groups of scholars that exist today, continue to exist today. One group of scholars continue to deny the genocidal and the intentional nature of the Holodomor, claiming that this topic is sterile, and I believe their perceptions seem to be informed by their own research that they conducted 20, 30, 40 years ago. Another group of scholars, and I believe our speakers belong to this group, moved forward with new ideas and posed new questions, with new methodologies, right, that offer us perspectives and on not only on the nature of the Holodomor and the dynamics of the Holodomor, but also they provide some evidential base for this argument that not only, there are a lot of Ukrainians who suffered during the Holodomor, but there were other people also among those who were victimized by the famine, meaning those who happen to reside in these territories in Ukraine at sites of mass starvation. Paolo Fonzi's, for instance, research on the Germans' awareness about the famine is, in my opinion, meticulous and instructive, and he uses a variety of German sources, archival sources, and they illuminate the suffering of German peasants during the famine. Revelations that were transmitted through German diplomats, through German consulates in Ukraine, and through German returnees from the USSR who experienced the tragedy. And he also made use of letters, a very valuable source also written by those starving ethnic Germans, and they sent these letters to their relatives who resided in Germany and other countries, including the United States. I think his research shows that despite the Soviet politics of silence and the Soviets' attempts to conceal the tragedy, informational leaks through various channels alarmed the international community in general and broader audiences in Germany about mass starvation and deaths in Ukraine in 1932-33. And in my view, the most interesting and fascinating part of Paolo's research is the examination of the role of various state and religious institutions in disseminating disinformation or actually information about the famine in Germany. For instance, he carefully explains the reasons behind the informational blockade established by the German Foreign Office, an attempt to comply with Rappel Agreement and to maintain nice relations with the USSR that had been, of course, complicated by Hitler's victory in 1933. Paolo also suggested that the German inner politics and conflicted interests obscured the knowledge about the disaster and state violence in Soviet Ukraine. In other words, despite the fact that many Germans, including German consuls in Ukraine, had access to reasonably reliable information about the scale of the famine in Ukraine, but despite of it, political experience in certain cultural stereotypes about the character of Soviet peasants were among those factors that shaped the attitudes of various German groups, agencies, and institutions toward the famine, which ultimately contributed to silencing the tragedy in Germany. My question for Paolo is about Goebbels' Ministry for Popular Education and Propaganda. I think you mentioned that in 1933 the ministry was reluctant to use famine as a tool of anti-Bolshevik propaganda. It was launched, though, later, right, in 1935. Did the ministry use the rhetoric of Soviet state violence associated with the famine after 1935, and do we have any research on that? Iryna Dmytrychyn offers us also a similarly enlightening analysis of Eduard Herriot's attempt at whitening the tragic story of the Holodomor, a French radical politician who served for many years as president of the Chamber of Deputies. His brief trip to Ukraine in 1933, where he observed, so to speak, show case prosperous, right, Ukrainian villages instead of this sort of a Kafkian sort of lifeless and frozen space of mass starvation and deaths, realities actually that were thoroughly hidden from Herriot's eyes, reminds us also of the trip of the American writer Theodore Dreiser to Ukraine in 1927-28. And by the way, during this particular time, the Ukrainian countryside was, there was a war, actually a true war in the Ukrainian countryside in 1928 already, because people began to starve. Dreiser was also among those who fully experienced actually this, the Soviets' friendly grip during his journey to Soviet Russia. Error, how can we identify him? A French Durante, perhaps, depicted Ukraine of 1933 as a garden in full bloom, with a rich soil and magnificent harvests. In Iryna's analysis, he suspected and knew about the tragedy, but he chose to deny and silence the famine for reasons associated with political and economic motives that would improve Franco-Soviet relations. And in light of the developments in Germany, perhaps it's understandable. And the Franco-Soviet rapprochement was the priority. For Iryna, the question of whether Error was voluntarily blind or cynical seems to remain unanswered. And my question is, have we sort of exhausted all those resources that would perhaps help us understand his subjectivity? What happened to him after 1933, 1935, and later, after maybe several years after the tragedy? It would be nice to perhaps to think of potential possible sources that would reveal more about his personality and what he believed in, what he thought about the regime. Eduard Baidaus' research illuminates a significant, I think, methodological gap in the scholarship of the Holodomor. He examines archival collections pertaining to the Holodomor in Romania and Moldova, sources that have been investigated by scholars of Holodomor studies. And the wealth of these documents allows us to analyze popular perceptions and interpretations of the Holodomor in these two countries in the context of complex relations among Ukrainians, Russians, and Romanians, exacerbated by territorial disputes, political and cultural differences. Eduard also touches upon a very interesting, in my opinion, topic. It's people's attempts to escape from the USSR to Romania, and not very much has been written about this. And of course, those people were interrogated by the Romanian secret services, and inevitably, the refugees leaked the information about the Holodomor, which might have shaped sort of public opinion and the state's attitudes toward the Soviet regime in Romania. My question to Eduard is about the language of these sources. You mentioned that almost all of them are in Romanian, correct? And in Moldova, it's just the same situation, right? And to what extent can we, rely on these sources? Because I don't know very many scholars, for instance, in North America, who have the skills, language skills, to examine these sources. Do you know scholarship or those scholars who know the language, who have those skills to go and to investigate the sources? Because you showed us a few sources that have been published, I think, in Romanian, correct? Can you share with us this knowledge about those perhaps published sources in English? Because I cannot, for instance, read Romanian. And it's just a shame, and I would go there. And, like Himka, sometimes he was saying that if you know that the sources are there, learn the language, go there. I'm too old for that, but maybe a new generation of scholars will do that. In all three papers are sort of connected through numerous, I think, intellectual and conceptual threads. But one theme seems to be prominent, the Soviet politics of silence. And control of discourse and control of information in the USSR and beyond that initially obscured the knowledge of the international community about the Holodomor. And when I was reading these papers, I was thinking, a common assumption is that whoever controls the discourse or information has power. I believe an opposite supposition seems equally true. Whoever commands silence also has power. And the knowledge about the reasons behind silence in the Holodomor in the USSR and beyond opens sort of the window into the past to reveal how powerful silence was and how it shaped the international interwar politics. Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid that we don't have very many minutes left for responses from the audience. But so I thought perhaps we would just move straight to having some questions from the floor. You can respond to Olga's points as you're doing so. So maybe we'll just collect a couple of questions from the floor, and then we'll ask our speakers to respond. So
Olga
please
Andriowski.
Introduce yourself as you.
Olga Andriowski, Trent University. I have something for everybody. For Iryna, I think the timing of Ero's visit is really crucial. Ukrainians in July, August 1933 launch a worldwide campaign to bring the attention to world leaders of the famine in Ukraine. There's the letter of Cardinal Initzer, there's the appeal of the Ukrainian Catholic bishops, there's Dr. Amelde's report. Milena Rudnicka is sitting at this very moment, Polish parliamentarian, feminist Ukrainian, is sitting in Switzerland trying to convince the League of Nations to take this up. And this is precisely the moment at which the Ero visit is arranged by Stalin himself, as I learned from you. And in 1958, on the 25th anniversary of the Holodomor, Milena Rudnicka, in an article in Svoboda, a long article, writes that the Herriot visit was the culmination of the disinformation campaign, that it completely neutralized them. So that's something worth looking at, I think, is the very precise timing of that visit in connection to this larger campaign that's going on. For Paolo, my question is similar. Did you find in the German archives any reflection of Ukrainian emigres trying to appeal to the German government? And also for Eduard, we know that two of the Romanian parliamentarians who were Ukrainian went to London at this very time to try to appeal to the MacDonald government. So to your long list of things that need to be researched, I would also add that I would love for somebody to write something finally about the Ukrainians who fled to Romania, because we know there were thousands of them and that they were interviewed, as you said, by Romanian intelligence. So I'm sorry, I don't really have much of a question except for Paolo, but.
Comments are good too. So please introduce yourself, Hero.
I'm wondering if Paolo can say something about this.
I think we'll have a second question, and then we'll let each of our speakers say a very short word or two, and then we'll have go to our break if everybody's in agreement. Okay, so Hero, please introduce yourself.
Hiro Ake of Indiana University. I have many questions, but I'll restrict to only one question for Paolo. You said that German diplomats tended to be silent on the famine because they wanted to continuity in German diplomatic German policies toward the Soviet Union. Now, as I recall it, someone, maybe this Gustav Hilger, I don't remember. I'm terribly sorry. It's a spam call. He says he see, or maybe someone else, I can find out. They emphasize the importance of the Soviet-Polish Non-Aggression Pact, which was signed in July 1932, but was not ratified until early December 1932. They understood that this Non-Aggression Pact meant the end of Rapparo system, because the Rapparo system didn't specify any eastern borders of Germany, whereas Locarno did acknowledge the settlement of Versailles Treaty. Now, when this Non-Aggression Pact was ratified, then it seems to me that Moscow started cracking down on Ukraine very harshly because Poland would not intervene. And that's the reason why many resources were diverted to the east when Japan was threatening, or at least Moscow believed that the east was more important. I might say a few words in my own presentation, but it seems to me that they were already giving up on Rapparo Treaty.
Thank you. So I'll ask each of our speakers, we'll start with Paolo just and come this way, to just say a word or two in response, and then we'll go to our break.
Does it work? Yeah, I think so. So for the first question, was about Goebbels, actually. Yeah, actually, so Goebbels' ministry didn't take part in the campaign. It stepped back, I would say, from a possible campaign on the Holodomor in 1933, and then that was your question. And then actually, so because in general, so one could say, so between 1933 and 35, anti-Bolshevik propaganda was not that strong in Germany. It started actually in 1935. After this period, actually, and that was your question, so there was, Holodomor was part of this propaganda, of anti-Bolshevik propaganda when it started after 1935. For example, one of the publications that I showed, so the one with the, that contained a report by Fritz Dietloff, that was the director of the Drusak of the German concession in the agricultural concession in the Soviet Union. He and was actually in the Soviet Union at the time of the famine. He actually published in a book that was actually promoted by Goebbels' ministry. He published a report about the famine, the Holodomor. But this is only one of few examples, and I wouldn't say that actually the famine was a prominent part of the anti-Bolshevik propaganda until Second World War. And I was struck by the fact that analyzing some of the publications about Ukraine, for example, Nazi propaganda speaks a lot about collectivization, deportations, policy against the nationalities, for example, so these kind of things. And the famine is mentioned, but not so with a particular emphasis. You know? And I was struck by this fact, and I think my explanation is that in the eyes of the Germans, they saw collectivization, famine, anti-nationalities politics as a whole thing. So they didn't make much distinction in the whole process between these aspects. As for the second question, there was actually, so there were many expectations from Ukrainian immigrants that actually, so the Nazi government might join a campaign or might initiate a campaign, and even in Germany. So there were this kind of expectations, and actually many expected that Alfred Rosenberg might actually be one of the leading of the leaders of such a campaign. But actually, so the Nazi government never considered in the beginning. So because at the time of the famine, actually, so it was a period when actually the new National Socialist rulers wanted to poster as moderates. So they didn't want to be regarded as those that wanted to bring discontinuity in foreign policy. And this for the first year of rule. And so, so my idea is and actually, Alfred Rosenberg didn't play a major role in National Socialist system in general. So he was actually the one who could have started a pro-nationalities campaign, pro-non-rationalities campaign in the Soviet Union, but he wasn't a prominent figure actually after the Second World War, when actually it was the ministry for the occupied eastern regions. And then as for the Rapallo policy, actually what the diplomats of the Foreign Office wanted to do was actually to save the spirit of Rapallo. So they talked a lot about the spirit of Rapallo, and the idea was actually to save this policy that was already had been already put under strain in 1932. So it was sort of so they had the intention so they were actually attached to the idea of the special relation with the Soviet Union as part of the German foreign policy.
Thank you. Iryna, do you have a word or two you want to say?
No. It's okay. As I said, the only thing we are missing in this trip is the intimate stratum. What Herriot really thought about this trip. And unfortunately, the journey was private, rather private. So we have no documents in French diplomatic or political archives. And the career of Herriot was really very rich and long. This episode is in his real political career is a very, very small episode. So I didn't find precise indications about this personal thing. But we have some Soviet reports when Soviet authorities were frightened about scenes of misery or not very brilliant things that he saw, and the Soviets were afraid that he would speak about it, but he never did it. In his reports, everything was brilliant. Concerning the Ukrainian immigration in Europe, of course, I read everything about Milena Rudnetska, his work, and I was focusing on the September, on the trip of Herriot, but on the September the session of the League of Nations, and all this preparing work would lead in the spirit of Ukrainians to the session of League of Nations and the official condemnation of Soviet politics. But in this moment, Herriot is back from Soviet Union, and his declarations are really astonishing and give impossible to spread the information about the famine. And Milena Rudnetska was really very disappointed, and he has convinced Movinkel to study documents, to speak about it. But Herriot declarations was definitely give impossible this speakings about famine. And Ukrainian delegation on this session of League of Nations were invited to join the German delegation in speaking about the famine. And Ukrainians decided finally to not join German efforts and to dissociate German's declaration and Ukrainian aspirations to denounce the famine.
Thank you. Eduard, a word or two, and then we'll wrap up.
Just two, maybe.
I think if I would answer all questions, it would take the time for another presentation. So
We want our
I'll
coffee.
be quick, no more than 1 minute, and I'll take point by point. First, about language. I think most of the documents are in Romanian language. Sometimes there are documents which have two languages. If the person spoke Russian, then everything will be translated into Romanian by Romanian authorities. If you go to Romania, if you go to Moldova, you'll find documents both in Romanian language and in Russian. The second, can we rely or we cannot rely on those primary sources? Well, if we do rely on primary sources from Poland, Finland, Britain, France, why not from Romania? Considering that it was on the border, that's a lot of information over there. Scholarship, there are just a few publications in English. The majority are, if they are also a few in Romanian with some summaries in English. And I know a few persons who do their research on this topic, but this is not their main, so to say, activity. Then about the last thing what I wanted to say. In terms of primary sources, I think Romania and Moldova to some extent, it's terra incognita. And if we all know about El Dorado in the south and Klondike in the north, I think Romania is a sort of both in terms of documents about Holodomor, interpretation, perception in that country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we have lots to talk about during our slightly shortened coffee break. So thank you, everybody. And please join me in thanking our presenters.